Speaker.
I call the honourable member Paul Hutchison.
Mr. Speaker, it is indeed a pleasure to speak on this taxation annual rates and budget measures bill, but I must say, Mr. Speaker, perhaps it's a dubious pleasure to be following the Honourable Shane Jones, who perhaps is the quintessential example of the Labour Party work ethic, because after all, he was the man who went out on Make the Politician Work, off through the Manukau Heads, and what happened to him? He slept. He was asleep. Out he went through the Manukau Heads, and when they came looking for him, they couldn't wake him up. In fact, they had to turn on a fire alarm to wake him. If they didn't have the fire alarm, he would have gone out there for 3 days, and come back having achieved nothing. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to firstly acknowledge the Honourable Bill English for delivering a highly intelligent and balanced budget for the times, a budget that is indeed extraordinarily prudent and responsible, and a budget that ensures that health, education and our justice services are well provided for, and indeed they are the core winners of this budget, and indeed they are the core concerns of the ordinary New Zealanders. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, the budget delivered by the Honourable Bill English makes clear setting for our country to come out of deficit by 2014-15. And secondly, may I acknowledge the outstanding Prime Minister, the Right Honourable John Key, for the finest budget speech I have ever heard. The finest budget speech I have ever heard, rebutting the Honourable Phil Goff at every single point and clearly demonstrating the dire position that the Labour Party is in. And thirdly, may I acknowledge the Honourable Peter Dunn, who is responsible for this bill that deals with the fiscal costs of the Kiwi Saver scheme and Working for Families tax credit program. But, Mr. Speaker, it is this bill that is one of the reasons that health, education and our justice services are winners in this budget. And I want to just, by the way, pay tribute to the outstanding stewardship of Vote Health by the Honourable Tony Ryle, because in health alone we have seen $54 million in this budget to be delivered to maternity, including Plunket, well-child checks, hugely important for the potential of our children, $44 million for dementia care, again an area that is often left out, and this excellent national government has put this extraordinary amount in difficult times. 68 million more for elective surgery, and how we do remember the days when Annette King grew the waiting lists to over 130,000 and used to cull them 10,000 at a time. And 20 million more for medicines at a time where governments around the world are cutting their budgets for health and certainly for medicines. Mr. Speaker, there is a spectacular graph that shows the trajectory of where spending would go under a Labour government from 2008 if it continued in the same way. And it demonstrates, Mr. Speaker, that by 2023 the public debt would have ballooned to 60% of GDP. That's the sort of irresponsible trajectory that the Labour government would have put on the people of New Zealand. And, Mr Speaker, any sensible economist that I have come across talking about the New Zealand economy has certainly said that we must curb our spending. And we've heard the rhetoric of David Cunliffe, man of the people, who runs his electorate downtrodden there in Grey Lynn by remote control New Lynn it is, by remote control from St Mary's Bay. But, Mr Speaker, we have heard him and the Honourable Phil Goff talk about more spending, 5 billion more spending at least, 5 billion more spending at least, and probably significantly more than that. Mr Speaker, in stark contrast to the spending promises of David Cunliffe and Phil Goff, this John Key-led national government will bring New Zealand's deficits down to nothing by 2014 and 15, and if the same wise and prudential trajectory is followed, it'll be down to 20% of GDP by 2020, and if it continued on further, possibly down to no debt whatsoever, which would be a huge achievement for New Zealand. It appears, Mr Speaker, that Phil Goff is in absolute denial of reality. He claimed this was a do-nothing budget. He claimed that there was no plan, and yet, Mr Speaker, this budget is built on the National 2008 Election Policy 6-point plan, which clearly showed out a sustained pathway to growth. Mr Speaker, firstly, taxation, to ensure that we delivered a world-class taxation system with clear signals that those who are prepared to work hard would be rewarded. Secondly, reducing waste in the public services, and that has happened palpably, particularly in the health system. Reducing red tape and enhancing regulatory reform in the RMA, and bringing in the legislation for a flexible labour market. The New Zealand Institute of Economic Research has shown an extra 13,000 jobs as a consequence of that legislation having been brought in. Introducing standards in education and making science and R&D central to government policy. Mr Speaker, this budget is indeed a well-crafted budget, a responsible, pragmatic budget, and Labor, who opposes it, must be kept out of office for a very, very long time.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. As many of that opinion will please say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. The ayes have it. Party vote called for. Party vote is called for. The clerk will please conduct the vote.
New Zealand National.
58 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
42 votes opposed.
Green Party.
9 votes opposed.
Act New Zealand.
5 votes in favour.
Maori Party.
Toko wha e tautoko ana.
Progressive.
Oh, sorry, I was watching somebody else. Apologies. 1 vote opposed.
United Future.
1 vote in favour.
Honourable Chris Carter.
1 vote opposed.
Honi Harawira.
1 vote opposed.
Thank you. Honourable members, the ayes are 68, the noes are 54. The motion is agreed to.
Taxation, Annual Rates and Budget Measures Bill, second reading.
The Taxation, Annual Rates and Budget Measures Bill is set down for committee stage forthwith. I therefore declare the House in committee for consideration of the Taxation, Annual Rates and Budget Measures Bills. Mr Chairman.
Mr Speaker.